Welcome to this lecture on indifference curves, where we look at some of the advanced features of the basic model of indifference curve analysis. Here, what we're going to add in is a few things where we look at nonlinear budget constraints. So first up, we're going to look at gifts in kind, and then quickly we will just kind of go through kinks within our budget constraints. So for this example, what we're going to look at is policy regarding education, right, is what we're really going to look at. So we're going to compare education to all other goods, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to imagine a situation where originally we consume certain amount of education. And what we're going to do is we're going to assume normal preferences to start. So we're going to do two different policies and two different types of preferences. So we'll end up with 4 graphs here. This would be our starting point for our normal preference graph with a policy of a subsidy. So if this is our starting point, and if we subsidize education, we would get this new budget constraint over here, the blue budget constraint, okay? And what that would do for us, given our preferences, just kind of standard preferences, is we would increase our consumption a fair amount, right? So we would increase our education. Why would our picture look like this? Well, if we subsidized education, right, are we capable of consuming more of all other goods than we were in the first situation when our budget constraint was just this original black line here? Can we get more of all other goods? No, we can't. So we're still up here. But if we spent all of our money on education, does it stop at the original budget constraint point? It's no, because it's subsidized. So now we can move further out in terms of education. Well, that exists for all of these points throughout. And so what we can do is we can create this new budget constraint here. Given the shape of our kind of standard normal preferences, we end up just seeing different tangencies. And we move out in education, and we also increase our all other goods a little bit. Okay, that's kind of a normal case. So this here is a situation where we subsidize education, and we have kind of normal preferences. Now let's look at a policy where we have a gift in kind, right? This particular gift in kind is a gift of education. Often in policy, we would call that type of educational policy a voucher for education. It can't be used for anything else other than education. So it's a gift in kind. It's not a gift in just income so that you can go and consume more education. It's not a subsidy towards education. It's a little, ticket that says, here's 2 free years of education, or whatever it is, right? So we could get a voucher for education. Well, we can think about our original budget constraint, right, is existing, and then we get our tangency, and this is our original consumption point of education and all other goods. But then we put, with these normal preferences, we put a voucher in place. Now, with a voucher in place, we know at the extreme of education, we could get more education. We could spend all of our money on education, plus we could spend the voucher. We also know that we couldn't get any more of all other goods. If we spent all of our money on all other goods, we can't get more of all other goods by spending a voucher on it, because the voucher is only for education, right? But we don't just draw a straight line between these two like we would with a subsidy. Why? Because what we could do is spend all of our money on education or on all other goods, right? Like we just did there. We could spend all of our money on that, but then also spend the 2-year voucher, or spend whatever the voucher is, on education. So we could get the same amount of all other goods that we got originally when we spent all of our money on all other goods, plus we could get some education, how much ever the voucher was for, right? So we could get to these two kind of points are part of our budget constraint. And now what we can do from here is we can realize that, well, what's the relative price ratio of all other goods versus education after we have spent all of our voucher? Well, the price ratio after that point is the same as it originally was. There's no difference in the ratio between the price of all other goods and education after we've already used the voucher in its entirety. And so we get the same slope with the budget constraint, with the new budget constraint with the voucher, as what we had originally with no policy whatsoever. So we get this kind of second budget constraint here, this blue line that we have. And what we do is we see where it's just tangent to an indifference curve. We pick out that indifference curve and we call that indifference curve 2 here, the indifference curve that we have with this voucher policy. And again, we can show an increase in the quantity of education that we consume and also a little increase in all other goods. We could make it so that the increase was exactly the same as the subsidy, but we see an increase in education and an increase in all other goods. That's all we need for our analysis here. Now let's imagine a little different story. Here what we have is very strong preferences. Right? So here we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at a subsidy and we're going to look at a voucher. But now instead of having normal preference, we're going to have strong preferences towards all other goods. A lot of times when we do education policy, we're not really worried about the people who consume normal amounts of education. What we're trying to do is get education to those who maybe have the least amount of access to it, but also maybe those who have the least preference towards it. Their current trade-offs are such that they don't invest a lot in education. So we're trying to actually have policy that impacts those kind of people, the kind of people that have indifference curves shaped like I1 and I2 here, right? So let's look at what the subsidy does. When the subsidy moves the budget constraint out to the new budget constraint, the blue line here, what happens to the quantity that we consume? Well, we can look at the two optimal points and it's so close to each other and it's so jumbled that we barely get any change whatsoever. And the reason for this is you're subsidizing each unit purchased by these people who don't want to purchase education. And so by giving them a little bit of a subsidy, a little bit of a break on the price, they still just don't want to get very much of it. And so we get very little increase in education, right? And what we get is a very small increase in all other goods as well. Basically, this policy does very little for those who have a preference away from education and towards all other goods. So when we subsidize it, very little happens. But with the vouchers, look what happens. We can look at the optimal points in very similar shape indifference curves here. And what happens is because we don't just have this rotation, we have this entire gap here, this jetting out. Where our indifference curve is going to hit is likely going to be just right on that corner or very close to that corner. So what we end up with is actually a pretty big increase in education. If I give you 2 free years of education and you can't spend it on anything else, I am going to still purchase a whole bunch of all other goods, but I am also going to just consume that 2 years of education. So I can make it so that the person who has a preference away from education at least gets some minimal amount. It increases by at least out to that amount that I gave them with the voucher for free because, well, they can't do anything else with that voucher. And so this is by no means a proof that we should have vouchers in education or anything like that. There's lots of other factors to consider here, but it does show us some of the power of using indifference curves and using these non-standard shapes of preferences and budget constraints in helping us think about policy issues and what will actually happen when people face, say, changes in constraints, or if they have certain shaped preferences or things like that. We can analyze what is likely to happen within the situation, and we can make smarter decisions about the policies that we have. One final non-standard budget constraint thing that we want to consider here is a change in the slope of the budget constraint called a kink, right? So sometimes what we end up with is we have the price of some good changes at a certain level of consumption, or you get a frequent buyer discount, or different things like that, or maybe we have different stoppages. We can get different types of kinks within our budget constraints. So here we can just imagine that we have 2 goods, weights and boxes, and we can just pretend that this is this 1-to-1 ratio between these two, right, that we have as the price ratio. And so it doesn't really matter where we consume or anything like that, but we could draw in some indifference curve and say, okay, here's our level of indifference when we optimize. But really we're looking at the budget constraint here. What would happen if after, halfway through of our consumption of boxes. So after we consumed 20 units of boxes, right? What happens if the price cuts in half? Okay, well, let's look at this. If the price of boxes cuts in half after we consume 20 units, right? Our budget constraint after 20 units would no longer be that solid black line that was back there. Why? Because the price of a box now is, well, it's half as much. So we can get more boxes. So if our budget constraint used to go, say, out to 30 units, right? Now it's going to go out to 40 units. So we're going to be able to kind of increase the consumption or the potential consumption of boxes if our indifference curve would somehow hit in these points over here. Now, our indifference curve, as we originally drew it up, maybe is hitting up here, and this won't matter at all. We'll still consume less than the 20, right? But it could be the case that we really prefer to consume a lot of boxes, and what we end up with is, we get some indifference curve that does take advantage of this reduced price after the change in price from the consuming more than 20 rule here, right? Which would then allow us to get to a higher indifference curve because of the discount than the original situation where we don't have that discount, we don't get that red budget constraint, right? So here you can just see that if the price at some point in time changes, we will get a kink in the budget constraint. It could kink back, so maybe it is after 20 that boxes get more expensive. Well, then that would look something like this. Or it could be like the situation we drew here, where boxes get cheaper and it kinks out. And so you can think about lots of different shapes with budget constraints and different offers that companies give for different elements of different pricing schemes, giving different patterns of consumption. All right, that has been Indifference Curves, the Advanced Basics. Thank you very much for paying attention. This has been a presentation by Michael Clark.